Here is a number that should genuinely disturb you. 60% of millennials have less than $5,000 saved for retirement, not $50,000, not $5,000 per year of retirement needed. $5,000 total for the entire rest of their life after work ends. And here is the number that makes that one even worse. 15% of millennials believe they will never be able to retire at all. Not retire late. Not retire uncomfortably. Never. Retire. Now, before you assume this is a story about people who spent too much and saved too little, I want you to hold that assumption for exactly 60 seconds. Because what I'm about to show you isn't a story about bad decisions. It's a story about a retirement system that was quietly dismantled, rebuilt in a way that guaranteed most people would fail, and then handed to a generation that was told the rules were exactly the same as before. They weren't. And the people who rebuilt it knew exactly what they were doing. Today I'm going to show you exactly what changed, when it changed, who benefited from that change, and what the psychology of financial helplessness is doing to the largest working generation in American history. To understand why millennials can't retire, you have to understand what retirement used to guarantee. For most of the 20th century, retirement in America worked on what economists called the three-legged stool. Leg 1, Social Security, a government-guaranteed monthly payment for every American who reached retirement age. Leg 2, a pension. Your employer paid you a fixed income every month for the rest of your life after you stopped working. You didn't manage it. You didn't pick investments. You didn't need to understand the stock market. You just showed up, worked 30 years, retired, and a check arrived every single month, guaranteed, for life. Leg 3, personal savings, whatever you put away on top of the first two. This system wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. It required almost zero financial sophistication to benefit from. Then, in 1978, Congress passed a small technical amendment to the tax code, Section 401, subsection K. Nobody paid much attention. It was originally designed as a tax loophole for corporate executives to defer compensation. It was not designed as a replacement for pensions. It was not designed as the primary retirement system for 150 million American workers. But corporate America saw an opportunity. Pensions were expensive, enormously expensive. Every pension was a guaranteed financial obligation sitting on a company's balance sheet forever. A promise that had to be kept regardless of how the company performed. Regardless of what the stock market did. Regardless of anything. The 401k offered corporations a way out. Replace the pension with a contribution account, shift the investment risk entirely onto the employee, and suddenly, billions of dollars in guaranteed retirement obligations disappeared from corporate balance sheets overnight. Between 1981 and 2020, the percentage of full-time workers at large companies with a pension collapsed from 84% to just 28%. That didn't happen because pensions stopped working. They worked perfectly. It happened because pensions were expensive for corporations, and 401ks were cheap. The lobbying effort to accelerate this shift was massive, coordinated, and almost completely invisible to the workers whose retirement security was being quietly transferred away from them. Here is the difference nobody explains clearly enough. A pension is a promise, a guaranteed fixed amount every month for the rest of your life. The risk sits entirely with your employer. If their investments underperform, that is their problem, not yours. A 401k is an account. You decide whether to open it. You decide how much to put in. You decide where to invest. You bear every single dollar of risk. If the market crashes the year before you retire, that is your problem, not theirs. The retirement system didn't just change. The responsibility transferred. Completely. From corporations with professional money managers to individual workers who were never taught how compound interest works. Corporations saved billions. Workers got an account and a pamphlet, and then society looked at the outcome 20 years later and called it a personal failure. But the pension disappearing was only the first blow, because at the exact same moment the retirement safety net was being removed, the cost of building any kind of financial foundation was becoming quietly impossible. The average millennial carries $40,000 in student loan debt. Millennials represent nearly 40% of all student loan borrowers in America. Here is what that debt actually does to a retirement trajectory. A 22-year-old graduating with $40,000 in student loans makes a choice: pay down debt or invest for retirement. Most choose debt first, which feels rational. Debt is urgent. Retirement feels 20 years away. But here is what that delay actually costs. $5,000 invested at 22 grows to approximately $160,000 by retirement. The same $5,000 invested at 32, after a decade of loan payments, grows to $70,000. Same money, 10-year delay, $90,000 difference. Gone. Forever. Student debt didn't just cost millennials $40,000. It stole the compounding growth on every single dollar that went to loan payments instead of investments during the years when compounding matters most. And here is something worth knowing about who profited from that student debt explosion. Between 1980 and 2020, tuition at American universities increased by over 1,200%. The cost of virtually everything else in the American economy increased by roughly 236% in the same period. That gap didn't happen because education got dramatically better. It happened because the government made student loans federally guaranteed, which meant universities could raise prices without fear, because the loans would always be approved. The universities got their money up front, the students got the debt, and the loan servicers collected interest for decades. Then came housing. The cost of home ownership went up to 51% of median household income in 2025, from just 33% in the year 2000. That is not a gradual increase. That is a 55% jump in the portion of your income consumed by housing in 25 years. The formula every generation before millennials followed was simple: graduate, work, save a down payment, buy a house, build equity for 30 years, retire with a paid-off home and a significant asset. That formula now requires something previous generations never needed. It requires no student debt, no recession in your 20s, no city where rent consumes half your paycheck, and parents who can help with a down payment because saving one yourself takes a decade. Millennials aged 34 to 38 have a net wealth-to-income ratio of just 70%. Compare that to 110% for Gen X at the same age. Less wealth, more debt, higher costs, and a retirement system that now requires them to be their own investment manager. And then, there is Social Security, which millennials have been paying into their entire working lives, which is supposed to be the safety net that catches everyone. Social Security's trust fund is projected to face serious funding issues beginning in 2034. At that point, retirees will only receive about 78% of their scheduled benefits unless Congress acts. That date is 8 years from now, right as the oldest millennials approach their mid-50s. Now here is a question worth asking. Congress has known about this funding gap for decades. The projections have been consistent and clear for years. And yet, nothing meaningful has been done to address it, because fixing Social Security requires either raising taxes on corporations and high earners or cutting benefits. Neither option is politically comfortable, so the problem gets acknowledged, discussed, and quietly postponed, while millennials keep paying in with no guarantee of what they will receive in return. The first leg of the retirement stool being quietly sawed down by political inaction. The second leg removed entirely by corporate cost-cutting before millennials ever sat down. The third leg being held up by a generation carrying $40,000 in student debt, paying over half their income in housing costs, and navigating index funds alone with no financial education and no institutional support. This is not a character failure. This is a coordinated transfer of financial risk from powerful institutions onto individuals who had no say in the arrangement. Now here is where psychology enters, and this is the part that changes everything. Because you can explain the pension loss, you can explain the student debt, you can explain the housing crisis. Millennials understand all of it intellectually. But understanding a problem and psychologically functioning while living inside it are two completely different things. Over 75% of millennials say competing financial priorities materially constrain their retirement savings. That number is 30% for boomers. That gap is not a discipline gap, it is a structural gap that became a psychological one, and it was created deliberately. When corporations removed the pension guarantee, They didn't just remove a financial safety net. They removed the psychological certainty that effort would produce a predictable outcome. And without that certainty, the human brain does something very specific. Psychologist Martin Seligman documented it decades ago. He called it learned helplessness. When people experience negative outcomes they cannot change through effort, they stop trying. Not because they give up consciously, but because their brain learns at a deep level that effort doesn't produce results, so it stops generating effort. A millennial who graduated into the 2008 recession, who watched their entry salary stagnate for years despite doing everything right, who made consistent student loan payments and watched the balance barely move, who opened their 401k statement during a market crash and watched years of savings disappear overnight. That person doesn't just have less money. That person has been neurologically conditioned to believe the system doesn't reward effort, and that belief changes behavior in ways that compound the damage. They contribute less to their 401k because it feels pointless. They spend more in the present because the future feels unreachable. They avoid looking at their retirement balance because the number is too discouraging to face. Each response is psychologically understandable. Each one makes the retirement crisis worse. The system created the helplessness. The helplessness deepens the crisis. And then everyone looks at the outcome and calls it laziness. It isn't. It is the entirely predictable psychological result of asking people to succeed inside a system that was quietly rebuilt to make their success less likely, by the very institutions that were supposed to support them. Here is the truth this entire situation reveals. Every generation inherits a financial system shaped by the decisions of the generation before it. Boomers inherited pensions, affordable housing, a social security system that was young and fully funded, and economic conditions where a single income built real wealth. Millennials inherited the aftermath of decisions made in corporate boardrooms and congressional chambers before they were old enough to vote. The companies that lobbied to replace pensions with 401ks saved billions of dollars in guaranteed retirement obligations. The universities that raised tuition 1,200% collected that money up front. The politicians, who knew Social Security was underfunded and did nothing, kept their approval ratings intact. Everyone who built this system benefited from building it this way. Everyone who inherited it is still paying the price. They took the guarantee, kept the profit, handed you the risk, and called your struggle a personal choice. That is not capitalism failing. That is capitalism working exactly as designed, for the people who designed it. That is not a personal failing. That is history. And history doesn't mean destiny. Because understanding the system matters, but you still have to live inside it. The single biggest destroyer of millennial retirement trajectories is not the amount contributed. It is the consistency. 70% of people who experienced a major life event, a move, a medical bill, a job change, either paused contributions, took a loan from their account, or planned to retire later. A smaller amount contributed without interruption beats a larger amount contributed inconsistently, every time, because compound interest punishes gaps more severely than it rewards catch-up contributions. Automate your contributions before you see the money. Have them taken directly from your paycheck. Money you never see doesn't trigger the spending response, and it can't be paused during a stressful week because it never required a decision in the first place. Your employer match is the highest guaranteed return available to you anywhere right now. If your employer matches up to 4%, not contributing at least that amount is handing free money back to a corporation that already took your pension. That match represents a 50 to 100% instant return before a single investment is made. Nothing in the market guarantees that. Ever. And finally, reframe what retirement actually means for your generation. Retirement doesn't have to mean never working again. It can mean having enough saved that work becomes a choice rather than a requirement, that you decide what you do and how much, instead of being trapped by an income you cannot afford to lose. That version of financial freedom is achievable, even now, even inside this system. And the first step to navigating a system that was rebuilt without you is seeing it clearly, without the shame that makes you look away, without the helplessness that makes you stop trying, with clear eyes, an honest understanding of exactly what game you're playing, and who wrote the rules. Because the game, despite everything they built, is still winnable. You just need a completely different map than your parents used.